In looking at the war, Israel's war on Gaza today, two features stand out for me. First, the horrific genocidal dynamic of Israel's war, and second, the unyielding support for Israel from the United States and the Western powers. I want to really put two arguments. First, that these features are not solely a product of a right-wing political trajectory of the Israeli state and society, but flow from the specific character of the Zionist project. And second, that the relationship between the settler state and imperialism is vital in understanding the war in Gaza, the wider ramifications for the Middle East, and how we fight for a free Palestine. Okay. Zionism as a political ideology emerged during the 19th century as a response to rising modern anti-Semitism in all its virulent and horrific forms. It was only one response amongst others. I don't have time here to go into that contest of different politics and ideologies. The crucial thing here is that the rise of fascism, the iron shutters on migration and refuge that were slammed down by the US and the Western powers, and finally the horror of the Holocaust, cemented the hegemony of Zionist ideology amongst the majority of European and US Jewry. However, whilst anti-Semitism and the Holocaust explain the motivations of many of the settlers and why many Jews saw the Jewish state as a refuge, it cannot explain the foundations of the Jewish state itself. From its beginnings, the architects of the Zionist project conceived it as a colonial project. At the end of the First World War, it was to the preeminent colonial power Britain that the leaders of the Zionist movement turned. The Balfour Declaration, issued in November 1917, just after the October Revolution and towards the end of the First World War, declared the government's commitment to, and I quote, the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. What was the context? Britain and France were carving up the disintegrating Ottoman Empire. Britain was determined to exert its influence over Egypt, control over the Suez Canal, and, as much as possible, the region's newly discovered resource, oil. All this as the colonial empires faced the rising aspirations of the Arab masses. And here, in this combination, in this context, the Zionist project offered a unique role. Ronald Storrs, the first governor of Jerusalem, put it like this, British governor. He declared the aim of a Jewish state was to create a loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. And from its outset, the Zionist project was founded on the principle of a Jewish settler state and the exclusion of the Palestinian population. The Jewish National Fund purchased vast tracts of cultivable land from absentee landlords, and Palestinians were driven from their land and their homes. The kibbutz, the myth of which surrounds it, of almost a socialist, collective, equal commune, was in fact established to define, the kibbutzim was established to define the borders of a future Jewish state. The majority of the Jewish population in Palestine at the time were urban. They needed young, pioneer-spirited, ideologically motivated young settlers to take on the difficult task of putting down the settlements across the areas of Palestine that they wanted to carve out. And by the way, the kibbutz, 3% of Israel's population, furnished the core of the Zionist armed militia, the Haganah. Almost every chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Force came from the kibbutz. 25% of the pilots who bombed Lebanon to smithereens in 1982 came from the kibbutz. This is the socialist communal utopia that the kibbutz represents. The Histadrut, the so-called Jewish trade union, was founded to exclude Arab labour, boycott Arab produce, and break strikes by Palestinians. And none of this would have been possible without the patronage of British imperialism. The British provided arms, they provided training, they formed the special night squads during with the Zionist militia during the Palestinian revolt of 1936 to 39. By 1938, the Jewish population was 1/3 of the population of Palestine, and dispossession of the Palestinians was already underway on a scale. It resumed in earnest in 1946, culminating in the Nakba of 1948, and the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians. The Zionist myth of the Nakba is of a small, nascent Jewish state surrounded by mass Arab armies bent on its destruction. In fact, conservatively, Israeli forces outnumbered the Arab forces by at least 2-1. They were far better equipped by the British, trained in combat experience in World War II, and in the use of terror in the Palestine uprising. The Arab armies, on the other hand, intervened primarily to annex territory to serve their own rival interests in the region, rather than confront Israel. Glab Pasha, commander of the Arab Legion, one of the few forces that did seriously attempt to take on battle with the Zionist militias, described 1948 as a phony war on the part of the Arab rulers. 750,000 Palestinians forced from their homes, 13,000 killed, 530 towns and villages destroyed. One of the notorious examples is the massacre at Deir Yassin of over 200 Palestinian civilians. Ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and terror marked the foundations of the Jewish state. We have a paradox here, because in 1948, the old colonial empires were beginning to be dismantled. And it is just at this point that a new settler colonial regime is founded in the heart of the Middle East as a post-war global order takes shape. And what needs to be asserted here, I think, is that every Jewish Israeli citizen today lives on land taken from Palestinians. Many live in homes built on the ruins of Palestinian villages and in the homes of those driven out in 1948. And this is not just a matter of the past. Citizenship, Jewish citizenship of Israel, rests on the continued dispossession and exclusion of the Palestinians who remain within historic Palestine, and the denial of the right of return of Palestinian refugees. And the Israeli state has, from its inception, sought to continually renew its settler population, and by the same token, fix the process of Palestinian dispossession as a permanent feature of the state. Since its foundation, Israel has drawn in waves of settlers to colonise and provide an armed force against the threat of the Palestinian resistance and its foes among the Arab states. First, Ashkenazi Jews from Europe seeking refuge from anti-Semitism before and after the Holocaust, followed by waves of Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, and other waves of settlement followed, crucially, by secular Jews and non-Jews, actually, from Russia in the late 1980s and 90s. And each wave of settlement, it is true, generated competing claims, attempts to assert specific interests, extract concessions and privileges, but all these waves of settlement were bound to the state in a common material interest in maintaining the exclusion and dispossession of the Palestinians. Sorry. The title of this meeting is Zionism and Apartheid, a Marxist analysis. I want to say something about the apartheid character of Israel. Obviously, it is not just us or the Palestine solidarity movement that describes it this way. B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, describes the regime from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean as one common regime of apartheid. Similarly, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and so on. But I do think, and we obviously use that slogan and defend that description, and we all use it ourselves, quite rightly. However, I do think we have to go further because there is a potential ambiguity. You see, South African apartheid was dismantled without a revolution in the sense of bringing down the capitalist order. It was overthrown within, if you like, the parameters of the capitalist order. But Israel, I would argue, is not South Africa. First of all, the South African settler colonial regime was rested and founded upon the exploitation of black labour. Israel rested and founded on the exclusion, dispossession and displacement of the Palestinian population. And secondly, while South Africa was important to imperialist interests in the region and beyond, it was not, I would argue, the indispensable component that Israel forms as a fortress of imperialist interests in the Middle East. You see, why has there been no solution? The 1993 Oslo Accords, let's just remember that date a minute. You see, that was the year that minority rule in South Africa ended. And often the two events at the time were linked. It was portrayed as a time of hope, of new possibilities. Now, first South Africa, and now it will be Israel-Palestine. Okay? But what actually happened? Why did they collapse? The explanation of the collapse is usually explained in terms of political intransigence, either on the part of right-wing Israeli governments or the Palestinians, and usually both. And that somehow the effort has to be to simply convince somehow both sides to come to the table and agree. Well, let's just put this in the context. Let's step back a minute. In the November 22 elections, Labour Zionism, this was the political force that constituted the government of Israel for its first 3 decades, without challenge, really, supplied the chiefs of staff of the Israeli Defence Force, the intelligence services, Mossad, the whole structure of the state got 4% of the vote. Meretz, the left-wing Zionists that are most associated with the two-state solution, didn't even, for the first time, didn't even get a seat. Israel constitutes the biggest bulwark of the far right, the religious Zionists, and so on. It is the most right-wing element. These are, the young Zionists who shout at election rallies, dancing up and down, "May your village burn, death to the Arabs," and so forth. See, the truth about Oslo was that it was always a mirage. And there's the thing about a mirage, is that if you follow it, it doesn't lead anywhere. You just perish in the desert. What followed Oslo was an exponential expansion of the settlements on the West Bank, settlements that then were founded to fragment the so-called nascent Palestinian state under the Palestinian Authority, fragmented into discontinuous enclaves, while at the same time being walled in. Israel pulls out of Gaza in 2005, only to impose a vicious blockade. East Jerusalem is separated from the West Bank, and the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship within the borders of 1948 Israel are essentially subdued into third-class citizens. Quite rightly, we, not only we, but the radical edge of the Palestinian movement, probably certainly the majority of the Palestine solidarity movement in Britain, quite rightly argue that the two-state solution is no solution for the Palestinians. Something else, though. You see, it has never been considered by any Israeli government, not seriously considered by any. And I don't believe that this cannot simply be explained as a political decision by intransigent Israeli governments. See, Netanyahu just very recently declared that Israel, and I quote, must have security control over the entire territory of the Jordan, or the entire territory west of the Jordan River. Just think about what that control means. Over 7.5 million Palestinians. That territory contains almost equal numbers of Palestinians and Jewish settlers. And here, I want to argue that Israel is a very specific form of settler colonialism. On the one hand, it has the aim of founding a Jewish state based on the exclusion of Palestinians, and on the other, it's faced with a Palestinian population, particularly since the 1967 war, within the territory it controls, almost 50%. So the problem of a two-state solution for Israel would be that it's true, the very fact that it would only entrench Palestinian dispossession in a new form gives Israel a problem, because it would be incapable, because it's a two-state solution is incapable of resolving the question of Palestinian freedom, it would be incapable of bringing Palestinian resistance to an end. And therefore, the two-state solution, so-called in reality, would involve Israel pulling out, reducing its control over Palestinians, with the certainty that that resistance from the Palestinians would continue. So the two-state solution is a fiction, but it's a necessary fiction. See, Netanyahu's strategy, as indeed the strategy of governments before him, was to fragment, divide, and contain the Palestinians. Hence the carve-up of the West Bank into an archipelago of discontinuous enclaves, separated East Jerusalem, as I've said, the apartheid wall, the blockade of Gaza, and the horrible strategy that the Israeli regime termed mowing the lawn. Every now and again, you bomb Gaza, you take out the militants, you go into Jenin, and so forth. And up until the 7th of October, Netanyahu and his government actually believed they'd finally achieved what they required. The Abraham Accords with the Arab regimes were behind them, and the settlement, the agreement with Saudi Arabia was in the winds. And that was torn aside on the 7th of October. And all the arguments of the right wing seemed to come to pass. You see, in 2017, Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of the religious Zionists and the far right in the cabinet, presented what he called the decisive plan. The premises were, and I almost quote, that the national aspirations of the Palestinians are incompatible with the national aspirations of the Jewish people, which would always mean that the Palestinians wouldn't be able to accept it. The solution, he argued, was threefold. Palestinians had to be given a choice: to accept submission in a Jewish state from the river to the sea, to leave, or to be killed. And that, in a sense, reflects the dynamic that we're seeing in Gaza. But I want to argue that the attack on Gaza, for all its horror, therefore reflects also a crisis of the Zionist project. That none of those components of the Zionist project actually have a solution. And it also reflects a crisis of imperialism. The US has supplied, over decades, a total of around $260 billion of aid to Israel. Its aim was to guarantee the military superiority of Israel over all the Arab states. Biden, in December, announced $14 billion of military aid to Israel, the biggest spike in aid since the 1979 Iranian revolution. I want to finish with this. You see, for all that, I think what is crucial is to see the Palestinians as part of the Arab masses of the region. On Nakba Day, in May 2011, during the height of the Arab revolutions, thousands attempted to breach the Israeli border from Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. The Cairo embassy was occupied by thousands of protesters, laid siege, and ransacked for 2 days. And the wider context is important too. The decline, the relative decline of US imperialism, the rivalry with China. In a way, its attacks on the Houthis and Hezbollah and so on reflect a weakness as much as a strength. And finally, therefore, what is the solution? You see, in South Africa, apartheid could be dismantled. Partly, as I said, because of the importance of the black working class, but also it was not the same vital pillar of the imperialist order that Israel is. It's true that the US relies on its allies amongst the Arab regimes, but they have an Achilles heel. They can be overthrown from below. Israel has a distinguishing feature. No settler colonial state in history has dissolved itself. And it is Israel's settler colonial character that makes Israel a unique fortress of imperialist interest in the Middle East. Time and again, including within the solidarity movement sometimes, a solution is framed in terms of some kind of internal settlement within Israel. I think we have to look to the tradition, the Marxist tradition of permanent revolution, which places working class agency on the one hand at the centre of the revolutionary process, working class agency of the Arab working classes across the Middle East. If the Zionist fortress can no longer act as a fortress, then the very rationale, the material interest of the settler colonial state begins to dissolve. And finally with this, the other feature of permanent revolution is its international character. The eruption of revolutionary process throughout the system. And that's not a linear process. Each component will interact with the other. And one of those components has to be at the heart of the beast. See, we have always said quite rightly that the road to a free Palestine lies through Cairo, i.e. through the Arab working classes. That's true. But it also lies through the heart of the beast. And that's the importance of the demonstrations that we've seen here and elsewhere. It also lies through London, Washington, Paris, and Berlin. And the slogan of a free Palestine resonates in terms of the aspiration of the Palestinian people themselves to bring their dispossession to an end, but it offers a vision of a different society and a different world. A couple of quick points on that last question about the settlers. It's very important to see the role of the settlers, whatever the tensions there might be between the settler movement at various points, the government and different layers of the Israeli population. The settler project is completely bound up and rooted in the Zionist project from its inception. And therefore, to address the question of the settlers, this is a bit shorthand, you have to address the question of the Zionist project itself. Just one point I'd like to make in addition on the question of the parallel with Algeria. I think it's very important actually that we look at the specificity of each settler colonial project, because there are important common roots, but there are also important differences which particularly pertain to how the question of liberation. And the most important, I think, component here is that, of course, the Algerian population was in the majority, whereas this isn't true in Palestine. I want to say something about the points raised about oil, resources, and also actually about Israel's dependency on aid. You see, it is true, of course, that oil is an incredibly important driver in terms of the resource and fuel of world capitalism. There's no question. The US doesn't actually need the oil that's brought out of the Saudi Arabian oil wells. It's got plenty of its own. It needs, however, as Judith thought in a previous meeting, it needs to control the tap. And that tells us something about the nature of imperialism generally, the competition between not only the major imperialist powers, but also what we might call the sub-imperialist powers, and the contradictions and conflicts that give rise to that, but also about the nature of imperialism in the Middle East. Because there has been a transformation. You see, it's not the case that the relationship between the US and the big powers and the states in the Middle East is one of simply resources extraction. On the contrary, as has been described in previous meetings today, Saudi, Iran, Turkey, these states are centres now of capital accumulation in their own right. They don't just produce resources for the major powers and consume the goods that those that the major that imperialist powers sell and so forth. And that produces huge tensions as they compete within itself. Saudi Arabia, for example, amongst many other states, now has a policy of what they call strategic autonomy. What that means is they balance their own independent ruling class interest against the US on the one hand, China at another moment, and their own interests in another. You can see this in the way that China brokered the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran and so forth. And I think we have to be careful about Israel. You see, it is true that up until, say, the 1970s, 80s, that Israel was completely dependent not only on military aid, but economic aid. But actually, that aid has transformed a large element of the Israeli economy. It also is a centre of capital accumulation on the world scale. That is partly why the far right in Israel are more confident about defying the US and so on at certain points. In his decisive plan, so-called, Bezalel Smotrich finishes with this, that Israel no longer needs to take any cognizance of the international community. They will just have to accept what we do. Ben-Gvir put it more starkly more recently when he said, we are no longer a star on the Stars and Stripes of the United States. Now this brings me to something else, you see, because Israel, whatever the far right, the logic, wherever the far right logic takes them, I want to return to this. Israel is founded on two elements: the settler colonial project on the one hand, and the fortress of imperialism on the other. And however it might seem, those divisions still exist in Israel, in the Israeli Zionist leadership. And they reflect, if you like, the crisis of the Zionist project. Because the logic on the one hand is to say, smash the Palestinians, smash the resistance. There's a slogan that I really like from the PSC placards, actually: exist, resist, return. I think it actually says something about the nature of the Palestinian resistance, but also the crisis that Israel faced. Because as long as the Palestinians exist, the resistance exists. It erupts time and time again. And the question of return hangs over Israel like a spectre. And so the logic of the right has that genocidal dynamic. You know, it's not simply just a conscious thing. And it carries the rest of the state with it at certain points. But let's just pause a minute. This is horrible, horrible stuff, right? It just needs to be said. They have slaughtered 30,000 Palestinians in Gaza. There are over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. There are over 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank. There are over 2 million Palestinians in what you might call 1948 Israel. Can the Zionist project dispense by whatever means with the Palestinian population without huge peril, not only for the project itself, but for imperialism across the Middle East. And I want to therefore finish, with this. The question again of the relationship between the Palestinian struggle for freedom, the struggle by the Arab masses against their own rulers, and the question of imperialism. Because it is, so when I say that the Palestinians are part of the Arab masses, that's not just a rhetorical question. Whenever the Arab working class has to turn on its own rulers, on its own ruling class, whatever the initial motive, whatever the initial driver, maybe it's the price of bread, whatever it is, they come up against the imperialist order in the Middle East. And in coming up against the imperialist order in the Middle East, they come up against the question of Zionism. Why is it that Palestine, just inspired those protesters in 2011? Of course, solidarity, of course. But it is actually a material bond, a material interest. They face the same enemy. And I can't envisage a successful anti-imperialist movement in the Middle East that doesn't have the Palestinian component, at its heart. It's not just a question, when we say the road to Palestinian freedom lies through Cairo, this is true. But that doesn't mean to say the Palestinians are the passive beneficiaries of a revolutionary process that is outside them. They are part of it, a necessary part of it, because the imperialist order in the Middle East has the fortress of settler colonialism at its heart. And therefore the Palestinian struggle becomes an indissoluble component. And finally, I just want to finish with this at home, because there is a danger, I think, that we see our own protests, perhaps only in the very important sense of solidarity, but we're part of the process of revolution too. You see, there's a very interesting poll in the United States. The heartland, the heart of the beast. This question, before in December, in the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians, which side do you sympathise with more? Taken as a whole, the poll was pretty overwhelmingly with Israel, except for the 18 to 29 age group, 46% of whom sympathised more with the Palestinians, 27% with Israel. And then this, 91% of Jews over the age of 50 favour the Israeli mission, the Israeli attacks on Gaza to continue. Among Jews between the ages of 18 to 29 in the US, it is a majority. I mean, think this was taken in December, with all the stuff about the 7th of October. 60% of that age group of Jews supported Israel's military operation against Hamas. 26 opposed it, 26%. That's a big minority to start with. And the crisis of imperialism in the Middle East is deepening. The rivalry. US is facing overstretch. China, Southeast Asia, Ukraine, and now the Middle East. In that situation, the question of revolt, the question of permanent revolution, from Palestine to the Arab masses to the heartlands of imperialism and back again, becomes the question that we have to seize upon, radicalise the movement, and build a revolutionary current and a revolutionary pole to free Palestine and to build a different and bring down imperialism.